Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the 2012 free response question from the College Board. So let's get started here. Okay, so question number one is actually dealing with the role of Congress and their primary duties. And the three primary duties that they talk about here is one, writing laws, two, overseeing implementation of laws, and three, the third one, is basically serving constituent needs. Now, part A is describing the role of the three things here. Senate filibuster. Second is House Rules Committee. And third is the Conference Committee. So what are they asking here? You have to find the rules of these three. Now, if you want to individually write out like free responses, remember, grammar is not important, your writing style, as long as you have the content. So if you want to write it in an essay format, that's perfectly fine. You probably don't want to do like bullet points. So you do want to write something somewhat cohesive. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to write short. I'm not going to write out as you would necessarily on the AP exam, but I'm going to kind of highlight certain things. But you do want to use full sentences for writing the free response answers. So what does it mean in terms of a Senate filibuster? So what a Senate filibuster does, again, in the context of writing laws, it allows an individual senator to block legislation and delay business on the floor. So if you want to give examples, you could talk about Strom Thurmond. He gave his attempt to try to filibuster legislation in the 1960s. And more recently, this is where having knowledge of certain current events does help. Rand Paul, a senator from Kentucky, tried to filibuster a judicial nomination as well. So the filibuster can be used to prevent passage of an unfavorable piece of legislation, and that's why it's significant in terms of its role in passing laws. Now, in terms of House Rules Committee, well, it's one of the three exclusive committees and basically the role it plays in writing laws, it manages flow of bills that go through Congress. So the common terminology is that they are like the traffic cop. And so it can be more efficient. It can make it easier or harder to get through the House. Again, depending on the objective of the person who's maybe the chairman of the Rules Committee. Remember the three exclusive committees. You have the Rules Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. So these are the committees that hold a lot of the power. And so you could give the example of David Dreyer, who was a former chairman of the Rules Committee when Republicans were in power in the late 90s and early 2000s, and basically their role is to again, in the context of writing laws, their goal is to make things easier, to smoothly and efficiently get a bill passed through Congress. And again, the opposite can take place. They can try to delay passage by adding things that might make it so that the bill is not passed. Again, depending on the political party that's in power and the origin of the bill in terms of whether it's from Republican or Democrat as well. Okay, and the third one that would get you the third point is dealing with the conference committee. You know, basically for this part, you're not doing a whole lot more than writing out the definition. But again, try to write as much as you can so that you can give your answer a little context here. So the goal is basically to iron out differences between the HR or the House version of the bill and the Senate versions of the bill. And so you can say that you can say how in order for a bill to become law, they have to go through the exact same version. And so members of the House and the Senate, they join together and they come up with a compromise piece of legislation that is sent back to both houses of Congress, and then it becomes a law. So again, if you have those elements, then you're going to get the 3 points. Okay, part B describes, you know, one method of oversight. So this is dealing with the second part that Congress does. How does Congress oversee implementation of laws? And so there are you know, several different ways you could have approached it. One possible answer could have been through the budgetary process. And so through the budgetary process is basically the power of the purse. So Congress can oversee implementations of laws by defunding or adding extra appropriations to a particular bureaucracy, or through committee hearings. So Congress has the power to hold public hearings and you know, get people talking about, you know, what's actually going on in a particular bureaucratic setting. Another thing that the Congress can do in terms of confirmation of appointments. So the president is the one that appoints, but the confirmation of appointments actually goes through the Senate. So part of that is through committee hearings. So, you know, whoever is nominated to be the head of a bureaucratic organization, Congress can hold hearings and listen to testimony. And basically, they have the power of oversight, and that's how they're going to exercise it. And again, kind of along those lines, oversight, they can actually conduct investigations regarding if there's been accusations of misconduct on a particular bureaucratic agency, or simply they can actually create new legislation. So that way they can limit the discretionary authority of the bureaucratic organization by simply creating new laws that either make it tougher or actually can make it easier for a bureaucratic agency, and thereby Congress is exerting its influence in terms of implementation of laws. Okay, and finally, part C of question number 1 deals with you know, how casework can affect members' attention to legislation. And there's really 2 ways that you can look at it. So you can, if you want to argue both sides, but you probably want to stick to just one side here. Now, if you're a little bit more of an optimist, then you could make the claim that basically, you know, awareness of constituent needs basically is going to allow to focus on relevant legislation. So for example, let's say there's an issue with Social Security that's fairly common in the district, then the congressman can introduce legislation that streamlines the process for collecting Social Security. So figuring out what the needs of your constituency is, or what the needs are, and then basically using that experience to actually enact a public policy change. That's one way you can look at how casework can influence legislation. Or you can take more of the pessimistic approach. So if you're pessimistic, again, both answers are equally correct. Depends on how you go with it. You can say that dealing with problem can divert resources to enacting legislation. So you can look at it as dealing with constituents is a nuisance, and the time that you're spending with the people is actually taking away. Particularly, you can make the case, give an example of a California senator having to fly to Washington, D.C., and to try to be relevant, to try to keep in touch with the people by constantly moving back and forth from D.C. to California. You can make the argument that it takes away from any type of legislative accomplishment that a congressman could make. So again, you get 3 points right here. 3 points for point A, or question number 1A, with the filibuster, House rules, conference committee, and explaining the role in writing laws. You get 1 point. You just choose one of these methods of oversight that Congress has in terms of bureaucracy, and basically 1 point in how casework can affect members' attention to legislation. So that'll give you the first 5 points on this FRQ. Okay, question number 2. Number 2 is actually dealing with minority representation in Congress. So this is being able to read a chart that's given to you, but it's fairly straightforward. So basically, you have a graph here, and you can see in front of you here. Basically, the graph is explaining how there's been a slight increase in African American population from 1960 to 2010. So there's been a slight increase in African American population, but there's been a relatively far greater representation of African Americans and Hispanics in the House of Representatives. So here are some numbers here. Again, you can kind of dissect it. You had a 10.6% African American population, and in 2010 you had an increase, not that significant, but 12.8%. But in terms of House representation, basically it went from basically statistically insignificant of 0.1% to a lot more significant 9.7%. Still relatively underrepresented in the House, but not nearly to the discrepancies shown here. Now, the same thing can be said with representation of Hispanics as measure of the general population versus membership in the House. Whereas Hispanics, the population was sitting around at 6% in 1960. Basically, the percentage of Hispanics in the United States in 2010 was something like 14.8%, and yet House membership was, again, an abysmal 0.1% of Hispanics in the House in 1960, where you have a much more significant 6.4% Hispanic representation in the House in 2010. So any way you want to slice it, basically you're arguing that there's much more minority representation in the House of Representatives in 2010 than there was in 1960, even though the population growth was not as dramatic. So this is 1 point. There's several ways of getting that. You could write an essay, but you'll still just get that 1 point. There's really only a couple sentences you really have to do to describe an increase on all accounts in terms of Hispanic and African American representation in Congress. So that'll get you that 1 point. Make sure you get that 1 point here. Okay, now the second 2 points actually deal with explaining how two of the following removed barriers to minority voting. One is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the second part would be the 24th Amendment. And so you get 1 point for explaining each. And there's 3 different ways that you can actually go about in terms of a Voting Rights Act of 1965. You can argue that there's removal of requirements such as literacy tests, requirements that prevented minorities from voting. You can argue that there is a federal oversight for instances where there was reported discrimination. So now, even though the states are the ones that conducted the elections, they were basically subject to scrutiny by the federal government. So again, the Civil Rights Act of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave somewhat policing powers to the federal government to prevent states from unfairly going about monitoring an election. And finally, one way that you could do this is they eliminated English-only ballots. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically made it so that ballots in languages were more accessible to different groups of people. Now, one of the things actually from a personal standpoint, I actually had an interesting story regarding that. I'm a naturalized citizen, so I became a citizen in the year 2000. That's actually during my senior year in college. So I was able to vote my first election in the election of 2000. What's kind of interesting is that most of the time I will vote in person, and but there's been times where I've actually gotten absentee ballots. Now, because of provisions in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I think an assumption is made that English is my second language and Korean is my first language. Where I live, there's a high percentage of Korean Americans living in the area. As a result, whenever I get an absentee ballot, the ballot actually comes in Korean language. And while I can read Korean a little bit, a lot of these propositions that are written only in Korean, so I actually have to use other sources if I want to vote on certain propositions. So, to me, it's actually kind of interesting that I get a Korean language ballot. But again, the reason why I do is provisions in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that prevented English-only ballots. Now, the 24th Amendment is the prohibition of poll tax. Now, here's the thing. If that's all you said, that probably wouldn't be enough to get you that point, because this is the idea of how minorities are prevented from voting and how the 24th Amendment actually increased minority voting participation. And so you would have to elaborate saying that minorities tend to be more poor than non-minorities. So again, you don't have to eloquently say something along those lines, but basically, proportionately speaking, those that are poor tend to be overrepresented by minorities. So it's not the prohibition of the poll tax per se that increased minority voting. It's the fact that those that by instituting a poll tax, they tend to affect those that tend to have lower incomes, which tend to be minorities. So you have to make that connection in order to get that 1 point. To just say the 24th Amendment prohibited the poll tax wouldn't be enough to give you that 1 point. So these are, this would get you 2 points here of the 5 points for this particular problem. And Part C is basically identifying what is one barrier that prevents minority representation in Congress, and explain why what you identified inhibits minority representation. So there's an identification and an explanation of the identification. So a couple ways that you can do it. I would say the major one that is probably the most standard that would for sure get you the point is the incumbency advantage. So you can argue that the main reason the barrier of not being in office. So because there's not as many minorities in office, that's the reason, because incumbents have an advantage and incumbents tend not to be minorities. And so it's only when incumbents actually leave office where now you give the advantage to minorities who are also incumbents. So that's probably the safest route to go. And if you explain that clearly, you're going to get that point. Or again, there's other things that you can talk about. You can talk about gerrymandered districts. And again, gerrymandered districts is kind of another way of stating how the incumbency advantage favors individuals. You can make the argument of prejudice, race as a factor. You can argue that there's a percent of the population that won't vote for an individual simply based on his or her race. I would say that compared to the 1960s, today it's absolutely not nearly as big of a concern as it was back then. But again, this is an answer that could provide as being acceptable. But again, I would go over the incumbency one. Again, you could also talk about electoral qualifications. So again, the constitutional requirements are being 25 years old, as far as the House is concerned, 25 years old, 7 years a citizen, and then resident of the state. Now in the Senate, it's 30 years old, 9 years being a citizen, and also resident of the state. But you can say that because a lot of Hispanics or African Americans, maybe relatively speaking, there's not as much experience in representation, so voters might not see minorities as being qualified in the sense that they haven't been represented in the state Congress. So only when it's kind of been equalized in the state senates or the state house or other lower levels of office, only then is there going to be more representation in Congress as well. So again, being able to talk about one of these advantages, again, you don't have to list all of them, just one of these advantages, write in paragraph form here, but incumbency probably being the more critical argument that you're making, and how the barrier of that being the case is it inhibits minority opposition here, or minority representation, not minority opposition. And actually another way that you can argue is not the actual minority that's actually running for office, but minority voting that's being prevented. And you can talk about the barriers in that regard, and you can make the idea that ID requirements. So what prevents minorities from voting is the idea of ID requirements. Or you can talk about English-only ballots. Or you can talk about felony convictions. And therefore some states may discriminate against felons. And again, you'd have to make the connection that you can argue that felons will disproportionately be minorities. Or you could use the argument that voter interest, for example. But again, you don't have to go through both routes. I would say the more traditional approach in attacking this question isn't necessarily going for the barrier in minority voting, but the barrier in having minority candidates actually win congressional seats. All right, let's jump on to question number 3. So question number 3 deals with interest groups and the way that interest groups influence or impact the political process, and how that sometimes can be at odds with the public interest. So part A is dealing with specifically 2 tactics of interest groups. So what are some of the tactics that the interest groups are going to use in terms of enacting policies that will be favorable to its members? Again, sometimes that might be at odds with the overall population. So one of the things that could be the case could be the following. As far as this is concerned here, actually, that's question number 4. So hold that in the back of your mind here. So these are actually two factors that affect the president's decision. So question number 3 deals with 2 political factors dealing with judicial nominations. I kind of jumped the gun there with going with question number 4. So this is actually question number 3. So what are 2 political factors dealing with judicial nominations? And there's several. I mean, even the list that is given as acceptable descriptions, there's probably a lot more that could be worded that could be correct. But again, probably in the list of what are some of the top possible answers, campaign promises. So the idea that you're going to be running for president of the United States, you're going to decide that you're going to have a conservative on the bench. So whatever you said as being what you're going to do, that definitely is going to be a factor. Gender. The last 2 appointments to the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. So I'm sure President Obama, seeing the lack of female representation on the Supreme Court, may have considered that in his appointment of Supreme Court Justice. And again, you could use that. You can use that as an example to strengthen your argument, so that you're not just saying gender. So what about gender? Or you can talk about geographic diversity. You don't want to have just representation of the state of Texas. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. And you can do home state senator. Now, this would only actually work with district courts, because home state senator would not really apply for the Supreme Court. But for district courts, absolutely, that could be a factor in terms of judicial appointment. Ideology. Again, the idea of either being a conservative or liberal. And, maybe, choosing a moderate, depending, again, upon the political ideology of the president. And again, kind of very similar to ideology is issue positions. Where does the Supreme Court nominee stand on certain issues, maybe with gun control, abortion? Again, that really is tied into ideology. And again, same thing with political party as well. Again, most justices aren't going to be overtly members of a political party. They try to stay as nonpartisan as possible. But again, if you dig through the background and if you properly vet a justice, you can figure out whether or not the individual is a member of the Republican or Democrat Party. Again, potential for confirmation success. Again, you might have like a great candidate, and you might think that this person might get through, but if that person lacks the probability of even being perceived as a good candidate, that can actually impair the person's ability to become confirmed. For example, I mentioned this in the lecture, in my Supreme Court lecture. President Bush nominated Harriet Miers, who a lot of members within his own political party, a lot of Republicans questioned Harriet Miers' qualification. And so that was widely seen as being a blunder on President Bush's part, because he chose a nominee that really didn't garner the respect of being the nation's top jurist. Again, professional background, that's definitely going to be important. Professional background, education, experience. And again, something like 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices have attended Harvard, and 3 of them have attended Yale. So you might talk about how, you know, going to an elite academic institution is an informal requirement. And again, race, you don't want to have just situation where Supreme Court is a member of just one race, again, for political purposes. Again, it could be religion. Okay, make sure you have a Supreme Court justice who's either Catholic or Protestant, something along those lines, or Jewish. We've never had a Supreme Court justice that's fallen out of the categories of those 3 I just mentioned. And also, free from scandal. So you definitely don't want to nominate a Supreme Court justice that is plagued with a lot of scandal. Again, that is really kind of another way of saying potential for confirmation process as well. Okay, so these are kind of some of the factors that deal with judicial nomination. All right, now as far as Part B is concerned, Part B is identifying what are two political factors of president's nominees and how it complicates confirmation. So whereas A is dealing with more of the president's political factors in deciding to appoint members to the federal judiciary, Part B is asking what are some political factors that affect the confirmation process. So once there is a nomination, how does the actual process as outlined in the Constitution, and that's kind of informally developed, how does that affect the president's nominees, and how does that complicate the issue? So again, you got to come up with 2 different factors, and for each of the 2 explanations, describe how it complicates things. So again, advice and consent of the Senate. Because of the idea that the Senate is involved and they're the ones confirming the nominees, that definitely adds a layer of whether or not the confirmation process is going to be successful or not. Again, campaign promises as well. So again, a lot of things that are for Part A can also be simultaneously used for Part B. So a filibuster, gender, again, geographic diversity. Again, a lot of the same things. Again, even if it might sound silly to be rewriting the same things, even though it may sound like you're redundant, go ahead and be redundant. There's no points taken off for being redundant. It is possible not to get points if you don't write it or write it in a way that is acceptable. So why not just rewrite the same thing for Part A and B, possibly. And again, you have the same issues, ideology, issue positions. And the one thing here that is unique to Part B that's not part of Part A as well could be the media. So televised Judiciary Committee hearings. And that can affect the actual process. And you can make the argument that the potential for confirmation success will affect both a president's decision to appoint a nominee, and once appointed, it might affect the confirmation process. Again, same thing as political party, background. Again, one thing that could be at play is senatorial courtesy. Okay, weak or strong nominee here. So this is a case where A and B, honestly, it just, at least to me, from my perspective, it seems like the things that are going to affect the president's appointment will also affect the confirmation process. So again, it doesn't hurt to repeat some of these things and just be very clear so you get the 4 points here. These are 4 points, 4 valuable points that you're going to be able to get on the AP exam. So I don't want it to be a case where you don't get the points because it's assumed that you already wrote it in Part A. Remember, they're asking for 2 different things, and again, it doesn't hurt to be redundant. Okay, Part C. Part C actually deals with explaining how one legislative power, so this is just 1 point here. So explain how one legislative power serves as a check on the judiciary or the court decisions. So what's one way in terms of checks and balances that Congress can check the judiciary? Well, there's a couple of things here. I would say one main thing is the process of amendments. So if the Supreme Court declares something unconstitutional, well, Congress can propose an amendment, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and then 3/4 ratification of states. And once that's taken care of, then Congress can basically make it such that it is checking the judiciary, because what used to be unconstitutional, with an amendment to the Constitution, it is now constitutional. Another one would be confirmation. So the president appoints, but the Senate confirms. So that is definitely a check that is given to the Senate in addition to congressional funding. And another major one would be impeachment. And one way too is legislation here. Now one strategy is that they're asking only for one. If you give 2, like let's say you're not sure about one, then throw 2. And this is one of the advice that I was given when I've attended some of these AP government conferences. If the College Board asks you for 3 reasons, go ahead and give 4 reasons. If they give you 2 reasons, then just throw a 3rd one out there. And again, if all 3 are correct, then that's fine as well. Let's say if you're given, give 3 reasons and you give 4, and one of them is kind of shaky, then if you have 3 legitimate answers, then you'll get the point. What you don't want to do if they say 1 and you give like 10, and maybe one of them sticks, then you probably won't get that point. Okay, and finally, Part D. Part D to this deals with explain how one executive power serves as a check. Executive power, how does that check the judiciary or judicial branch? And basically, this is the idea of separation of power. So the president doesn't have a lot of checks, so there'd probably be 2 major checks. So again, the major one is power of appointment. So the idea that the judiciary, they are subject to the appointment by the president. And another power in terms of checking the power of the judiciary is executive enforcement. So Supreme Court can theoretically say this has to be done, this is what the Constitution entails, or this is what we think is interpretation of the law, but the Supreme Court, they have no police power, so the Supreme Court can selectively enforce certain measures. So moving on to question number 4. Number 4 is actually the question that deals with interest rates, or interest groups, not interest rates. Interest rates would be more of a macroeconomic concept here. So question number 4 deals with interest groups, and they're trying to influence a political process. So they try to benefit members. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but benefiting the members at expense of the public. So part A describes what are 2 techniques, what are 2 tactics to influence elections that interest groups use. So what are 2 of the things that can be the case here? And the primary one that you kind of think of when you talk of interest groups impacting elections can be campaign contributions. There are limits as to how much can be contributed in an election cycle, but absolutely, campaign contributions. Another thing is interest groups can come out with candidate ratings or report cards. So if it's a pro-choice group, they can, rate, what is, how does candidate X, Y, and Z stand on issues relating to abortion? Again, if it's a conservative group, then it could be the opposite, and they can give the congressman a grade, A, B, C, D, or F, or it can go at a scale of 100, depending on how friendly that the congressman is to the interests of the interest group. Okay, it could be endorsements as well. They can seek endorsements they can publicly endorse a particular candidate. They can funnel volunteers to campaigns. So again, if there's a particular candidate that's lacking in manpower, then there's no law against interest groups funneling volunteers to campaigns. Kind of along those lines, get out the vote efforts. They can kind of help with that process. Again, PACs or super PACs. Okay, creation of these committees with the purpose of raising awareness that's not specifically related to the candidate. Remember, super PACs are prohibited from directly coordinating with the actual campaign, but these interest groups, they can, individuals can, be free to create their own super PACs. One of the things that was actually mentioned in kind of the grading rubric is that you can't double dip. You can't talk about the role of PACs and then your second answer being the role of super PACs. Okay, they only would count as one tactic. And again, another means could be, again, provide information on issues and candidates. And again, are some of these somewhat similar? Absolutely. But again, if you're asked for 2 tactics, it doesn't hurt to throw in a third one, or variations of something that's very similar. Because again, providing information on issues and candidates, that's actually a separate answer than candidate ratings and report cards, even though it's pretty similar as to what is acceptable. But again, these are actually 2 distinct answers, so you don't want to ignore the fact that you may think you only know one, but if you write it a different way, then you're actually giving 2 separate responses here. Okay, and part B, so part A is actually worth 2 points. So you have 2 points right here. And then part B is also 2 points. And part B actually is explaining how interest groups use each of the following to influence government decision-making. Issue networks. So this is a very simple explanation of how the iron triangle works here. So interest groups will try to use money and information. They'll provide information. They'll try to get as much resources as possible to get support from congressional committees, because that's where the work is really done in Congress, and through the bureaucracy. So what's going on is that interest groups, they want to be part of the, they want to be at the table when decisions are made. So what they're going to do is they're going to use as much money and they're just trying to use as much influence as possible to be able to get to access congressional committees, basically congressmen, and through the bureaucracy. They're going to try to do whatever it takes to influence decision making by providing money. So money doesn't necessarily buy votes, but it does buy access so that you're at the table when decisions are made. And then amicus curiae briefs. Basically, what's going on here is that they're used by interest groups to inform courts, to influence case, or possibly influence court reasoning or decisions. So interest groups, they realize that, you know, the Supreme Court, they're probably going to have their own view, but again, they want to be at the table, and so they're going to file these amicus curiae briefs to play the role of providing information to the court, and again, filing briefs on behalf of these interest groups. And finally, Part C deals with explain how each of the following serve to limit the influence of interest groups and media. So there's two roles that the media can actually play to limit the influence of interest groups. And so the media plays the role of the gatekeeper. So gatekeeper means that they're controlling information. So they're the ones that determine whether or not news is going to be news. So if it's the case that the media, again, media, it could be a combination of media, but if the media decides something is not important that the interest group really determines to be important, well, if the media ignores it, if it's not covered, then it's not going to make the front page news. So the media, they act as this gatekeeper of information, or they could be the watchdog. So, for example, if the interest group, if they're using shady tactics or unethical, they're coming up with unethical ways to influence the public policy-making process, well, the media acts as a watchdog to report. And who doesn't like watching a scandal unfold? That's what gets ratings. So the incentive of a media outlet to report something that's scandalous, if it's going to increase readership, or it's going to increase the number of views or hits, then absolutely, then the media can definitely act as this watchdog of interest group behavior. Now, what about pluralism? Pluralism will limit group influence because, this is basic tenet of democracy. Competition is competition among vast interest groups will dilute individual interest group power. So you could just simply talk about how if you only had, maybe a couple of interest groups and there's a limit to the number of interest groups that were able to make their case in front of Congress, how that could be detrimental to democracy. But when you have, freedom in being able to express opinions and having few regulations on interest groups, then you can argue that through pluralism, competition allows people to hear all sides of the story. And so this is kind of the argument in Citizens United that basically allowed PACs and basically allowed the creation of super PACs. That gave interest groups from both sides the ability to raise money and make their case known to the public. Now, is it a nuisance to voters that have to sort through millions of negative advertising, millions, I mean, maybe not millions, but maybe 100 pieces of mail that have negative advertising from a variety of interest groups that are set up through PACs? Yes, it could be inconvenient, but the idea of pluralism, because no one interest group has a monopoly over the airwaves, you can argue that pluralism serves to negate the influence of interest groups. And again, to me, that makes a whole lot of sense. If you let there be competition and let people sort things out, that's a free market way of doing things. Thank you for watching educator.com.